The morning sun barely touched the windows of Clarence's house when Camilla Parker Bowles stood in the drawing room, her hands trembling slightly as she held a cup of Earl Grey tea. Charles had just entered, his face showing the weight of recent events. The silence between them stretched like an ocean, filled with years of unspoken truths and buried emotions. She had rehearsed these words 1,000 times in her mind, but now, facing him, they felt heavier than she had imagined. The grandfather clock in the corner ticked steadily, marking seconds that felt like hours. Charles moved closer, reaching for her hand, but she stepped back, her green eyes meeting his with an intensity he had never seen before. "Charles," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, "we need to talk about us, about everything that has happened." Her words hung in the air like morning mist, delicate yet impossible to ignore. The man who would be king stood frozen, sensing that something fundamental was shifting between them. The palace staff had noticed a change in recent weeks. Where once there had been shared laughter over breakfast and gentle touches in passing, now there were awkward silences and avoided glances. The transformation had been gradual, like autumn leaves changing color, until one day everything was different. Charles watched as Camilla set down her teacup with deliberate care, the fine china making a soft clink against the saucer. She had been his rock, his constant companion through the storms of public opinion and family disapproval. Yet now, standing before him in the soft morning light, she seemed like a stranger. "Do you remember," she continued, her voice gaining strength, "when we first met at that polo match? You said I understood you like no one else ever had." A sad smile crossed her lips as memories flooded back. Stolen moments, secret phone calls, and promises made in the shadows of propriety. The future king's shoulders sagged as he sank into a nearby chair. He had always believed that their love could overcome any obstacle, that time would heal all wounds, and society would eventually accept what he had always known, that Camilla was his soulmate, his true companion in this gilded cage of royal duty. But Camilla remained standing, her posture straight despite the emotional weight she carried. "I've spent so many years waiting, Charles. Waiting for the right moment. Waiting for acceptance. Waiting for a fairy tale that was never meant to be mine." Her voice cracked slightly on the last word, betraying the depth of her pain. The morning light had grown stronger now, casting long shadows across the Persian rug. Outside, London was awakening to another day, oblivious to the drama unfolding within these historic walls. Guards changed shifts with practiced precision, and somewhere in the distance, church bells began their hourly chime. Charles reached out again, his hand suspended in the space between them. "Camilla, please. We've come so far. After everything we've been through, surely we can work through this too." His voice carried the authority of a man used to having his wishes fulfilled, yet underneath lay a vulnerability that few ever witnessed. She shook her head slowly, her perfectly styled hair catching the light. "That's just it, Charles. We've been through too much. The scandals, the public hatred, the constant comparisons." Her voice trailed off as she thought of Diana, the ghost that would forever haunt their relationship. The mention of his first wife, though unspoken, filled the room like a presence. Charles flinched visibly, old wounds reopening with familiar pain. The tragedy of Diana's death had changed everything, casting a shadow over any happiness he might find with Camilla. The public had made their feelings clear. She would always be the other woman, the one who destroyed a fairy tale. Camilla walked to the window, gazing out at the manicured gardens below. "Do you know what it's like to be hated by an entire nation? To have every move scrutinized, every word twisted? I've endured it all for love, Charles, but love isn't always enough." The man who had been raised to be king found himself at a loss for words. Throughout his life, he had been taught to command, to lead, to never show weakness. But here, in this private moment with the woman he loved, all his training failed him. He was simply a man facing the potential loss of his heart's desire. "The children," Camilla continued, still facing the window, "they've suffered too. My children, your children, caught in a web of our making. How many school events have they endured with whispers following them? How many friendships have been strained because of our relationship? Charles stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. But we're married now, Camilla. We made vows before God and country. Doesn't that mean anything? His voice rose with desperation, so different from his usual measured tones. She turned to face him then, and he was struck by how beautiful she still was, even with tears threatening to spill from her eyes. Of course it means something. It means everything. But that's precisely why this is so hard. She moved back toward the center of the room, each step measured and deliberate. The palace had seen many dramas over the centuries, kings and queens, loves and losses, triumphs and tragedies. Yet this quiet conversation between two people in their twilight years carried its own profound weight. There were no raised voices, no dramatic gestures, just the slow unraveling of a bond that had endured against all odds. I saw the poll last week, Camilla said quietly. Still, after all these years, they prefer William to skip you in succession. They blame me for that, you know. They think I've weakened you, made you less worthy of the crown. Charles's face flushed with indignation. Public opinion polls don't determine succession. The law is clear, and I will be king when the time comes. But even as he spoke the words, doubt crept into his voice. The monarchy survived on public support, and that support had always been tenuous where he was concerned. Camilla reached for her handbag, a simple gesture that somehow felt final. I'm tired, Charles. Tired of fighting battles we can never truly win. Tired of smiling when people wish I would disappear. Tired of pretending that everything is fine when we both know it isn't. The future king watched as she gathered herself, pulling on the armor of composure that had served her well through years of public scrutiny. Where are you going? He asked, though part of him already knew the answer. I need some time, she replied, not quite meeting his eyes. Time to think, to breathe, to remember who I was before I became the most hated woman in Britain. The bitterness in her voice was sharp enough to cut. Charles moved toward her, but she held up a hand to stop him. Please don't make this harder than it already is. We both know things haven't been right between us for months. The constant pressure, the weight of expectations, it's crushing us both. The irony wasn't lost on either of them. They had fought so hard to be together, weathered storms that would have destroyed weaker relationships, only to find that victory could be as bitter as defeat. The public acceptance they had craved remained elusive, and the price of their love story continued to climb. But I love you, Charles said simply, the words hanging between them like a prayer. I've always loved you. Isn't that enough? Camilla's composure finally cracked, a single tear rolling down her cheek. Love was never our problem, Charles. We've had love in abundance. But sometimes love isn't enough to overcome the weight of history, the burden of duty, the judgment of millions. She moved toward the door, each step taking her further from the man who had been the center of her world for so long. At the threshold, she paused, her hand on the ornate handle. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if we had made different choices all those years ago? If we had been brave enough to choose love over duty from the start? Charles's silence was answer enough. They both knew the paths not taken, the opportunities missed, the compromises made in the name of propriety and tradition. The weight of those decisions pressed down on them now, as heavy as the crown Charles would one day wear. It's too late now, Camilla said quietly, the words falling like stones into still water. Too late for what-ifs and might-have-beens. We are who we are, and we've made our choices. Now, we must live with them. The door closed behind her with a soft click, leaving Charles alone in the drawing room. The morning sun continued its journey across the sky, indifferent to human drama. The tea grew cold in abandoned cups, and somewhere in the palace, life continued its relentless march forward. Those who saw Camilla leave reported that she walked with dignity, her head held high despite the tears on her cheeks. She didn't look back at the building that had been her home, her prison, her stage for a drama that had captivated and divided a nation. Charles remained in the drawing room for hours, they say, staring at the chair where she had sat, replaying their conversation in his mind. The man who would be king, who had been trained from birth to show strength and resolve, sat alone with his grief and regret. The phrase echoed through the palace corridors, whispered by staff who had overheard fragments of the conversation. It's too late now. For simple words that carried the weight of decades, the pain of choices made and unmade, the reality of a love that had conquered so much but couldn't conquer everything. By afternoon, the news had begun to spread through the palace like wildfire. Something had happened between Charles and Camilla, something significant enough to shake the very foundations of their hard-won union. Staff who had grown accustomed to their quiet affection noticed the absence immediately. No shared lunch, no afternoon walk in the gardens, no easy conversation over tea. The Queen's private secretary was reportedly informed of the situation, though the details remained closely guarded. In an institution built on tradition and stability, any crack in the facade was cause for concern. The monarchy had weathered many storms, but the personal dramas of its members continued to test its resilience. As evening approached, Charles finally emerged from his self-imposed isolation. Those who saw him reported that he looked older, as if the hours had aged him years. He went through the motions of his scheduled appointments, but his heart wasn't in it. The spark that Camilla had always kindled in him seemed dimmed, perhaps extinguished. Meanwhile, Camilla had retreated to a private residence, away from the prying eyes of the press and public. Friends who reached out found her resolute in her decision, though the pain was evident. She spoke of needing to find herself again, to remember who she was beyond the labels of mistress, wife, and future queen consort. The days that followed were filled with speculation and rumor. The press, always hungry for royal drama, sensed blood in the water, but found themselves frustrated by the wall of silence from the palace. Official statements spoke of the Duchess needing rest, of schedules being adjusted, of nothing unusual occurring. But those within the palace walls knew better. They had witnessed the slow deterioration of a relationship that had once seemed unbreakable. The pressures of public life, the weight of history, and the ghost of the past had finally taken their toll. What had begun as a love story for the ages had become a cautionary tale about the price of desire in the public eye. Charles threw himself into his work with renewed intensity, as if activity could fill the void left by Camilla's absence. He attended charitable events, made speeches about climate change, and carried out his duties with mechanical precision. But those close to him noticed the change. The light had gone out of his eyes, replaced by a weary resignation. The irony of their situation wasn't lost on royal watchers. Charles and Camilla had fought so hard to be together, had endured public humiliation and family disapproval, had waited decades for their chance at happiness. Yet now, when they finally had the official recognition they had craved, they found that legitimacy came with its own unbearable burdens. Friends of the couple reported that there had been no single dramatic event, no explosive argument or shocking revelation. Instead, it was the accumulation of years of pressure, the constant feeling of being under siege, the knowledge that no matter what they did, a significant portion of the public would never accept their union. Camilla, in particular, had borne the brunt of public animosity. Despite her charitable work, her dignity in the face of criticism, and her obvious devotion to Charles, she remained forever cast as the villain in a story written by others. The weight of that narrative had finally become too much to bear. As weeks turned to months, it became clear that this was no temporary separation. Camilla began to build a life independent of the royal circus, reconnecting with old friends and pursuits that had been set aside in service of her royal duties. She was seen smiling again, though those who knew her well could detect the sadness that lingered beneath the surface. Charles, meanwhile, prepared for a future he had never imagined, one where he would ascend to the throne without the woman he had always envisioned by his side. The man who had waited so long to be king now faced the prospect of a hollow victory, a crown without the companion who had sustained him through the years of waiting. The palace, ever mindful of public perception, began the delicate work of managing the narrative. Statements were crafted to suggest mutual agreement. Schedules were adjusted to avoid awkward encounters, and the machinery of royal life ground on as if nothing had changed. But for those who had witnessed the love between Charles and Camilla, who had seen them laugh together at private jokes and support each other through public ordeals, the loss was palpable. They had been proof that love could endure, that second chances were possible, that happiness could be found even in the most unlikely circumstances. Now, their separation served as a different kind of lesson, that love, no matter how strong, sometimes couldn't overcome the forces arrayed against it, that the weight of public opinion, the burden of history, and the pressure of position could crush even the strongest bonds. As the seasons changed, both Charles and Camilla adapted to their new reality. They appeared at separate events, pursued individual interests, and slowly learned to navigate life without the other. The palace staff, ever discreet, never spoke publicly about the morning when everything changed, when 4 simple words had shattered a relationship that had endured for decades. "It's too late now." The phrase became a kind of epitaph for their love story, a recognition that timing in life is everything, and that some wounds, once inflicted, can never fully heal. They had found each other too late, married too late, sought acceptance too late, and now, in the autumn of their lives, it was too late to undo the damage that had been done. The fairy tale ending they had fought so hard to achieve had transformed into something else entirely. A reminder that in real life, love doesn't always conquer all, that public opinion can be a crushing weight, and that sometimes the price of getting what you want is higher than anyone should have to pay. As Charles prepared for his eventual coronation, he did so with the knowledge that the crown he had waited for his entire life would sit heavier without Camilla beside him. The woman who had understood him like no other, who had been his refuge from the demands of duty, was gone, not in body, perhaps, but in all the ways that mattered. And Camilla, free at last from the scrutiny and criticism that had defined her public life, found a different kind of peace. She had loved and been loved, had sacrificed and endured, and had finally reached a point where self-preservation outweighed all other considerations. The quiet words she had spoken that morning had set her free, even as they had imprisoned Charles in a future he had never wanted to face alone. The palace walls, which had witnessed so much over the centuries, absorbed this latest drama into their stones. Guards continued to change, tourists continued to gather, and the business of monarchy continued unabated. But those who knew where to look could see the cracks in the facade, the places where a love story had ended not with dramatic flourish, but with quiet words and the recognition that sometimes it really is too late. In the end, their story served as a reminder that even palaces can't protect against the fundamental human experiences of love, loss, and regret. That crowns and titles are poor compensation for companionship, and that the price of public life can sometimes be higher than anyone should be asked to pay. The morning when Camilla's quiet words shattered Charles had begun like any other, but it had ended with the dismantling of a relationship that had defined both their lives. And in the echoing silence that followed, the future king was left to contemplate a reign that would be marked not by what he had achieved, but by what he had lost along the way.